Good evening, friends. We are continuing the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, Swami's commentary based on what he remembered from Master. And we are up to where are we? Anyway, I'll know where we are after we pray, perhaps as the result of praying. There it is. Chapter 4, stanza 23 is where we are. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your guiding presence, your wisdom, your love, your devotion, your courage, your clarity, all of these qualities that we aspire to have in ourselves, that are present in these great scriptures, that are with us in your presence, ever near us. Guide us and bless us, that we may find our way home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Just as a small commentary, I won't be doing these seminars in March, just because as it happens there's conflicts with events at Ananda Village from which these emanate on both of the Fridays that I would have done it. So I'll see you right after Easter is when we'll start again. Okay, so now we're on chapter 4, verse 23 of the Gita, and we're in Swami's book under the Supreme Science of Knowing, which is chapter 16 in his commentary, but only 4 of the Gita. So we've been talking about, well, what we're always talking about, we're talking about what it looks like to be free. So here's some more stories about what it looks like to be free and how to get there. All the effects of karma, of action, are nullified in oneself, and one achieves liberation when ego attachment ceases, when one becomes centered in wisdom, and when all one's actions are offered up in sacrifice to the infinite. Then chapter 4, verse 24, for such a person, both the act of self-offering and the offering itself are equally aspects of the one spirit. The fire of wisdom and the person making the offering are both spirit. In this realization, the yogi, freed from ego identification, goes straight to Brahman, straight to the spirit. Well, there you have it. Okay. Swami says something interesting here. He says, any karma performed has consequences, no less so in the case of a liberated master than of the worldly person. The difference is that since the actions of a master are not performed with ego identification, the effects of that action are not bound by ego and flow out freely into the world, bringing only beneficial results. Their objective rewards are reaped by those who are in tune with them and accept them lovingly. That was the part that was interesting to me. The objective rewards of the master's karma, because they're not attached to his ego, essentially go to his disciples and to his devotees. And I think there's so many dimensions of the way the guru interacts with the disciple and the effect of the guru's interactions on the disciple. Every time I've read this one, in this book or in other places, because the master has no ego, the positive result of his karma does not attach to him, but attaches to those who are in tune with him. It's not as if I can actually fully understand that, except, let me just think about this for a minute. except in a certain way, I guess I would have to say I experienced it. Because I lived in the wake, so to speak. I mean that, well, I think I actually mean it exactly that way. I lived in the wake of Swami Kriyananda. He was this enormous force that moved through the world, and I was always sort of following behind, like a water skier without a ski, but just following behind in the space that he created by the dynamism of his energy. And I feel that Master's presence in this world has similarly created an opening in his little pamphlet, The New Dispensation, about which I gave many classes in my 9 a.m. satsang. I don't know, you could find them on YouTube somewhere without too much trouble, I think. Swami talked about when enough people pray sincerely enough, it draws from the infinite a special dispensation. Master said that his incarnation in this world was a special dispensation. And I said to Swami, does that mean that we actually receive more than we have earned? He says, to a certain extent, yes. That is exactly what happens. And he said an area, as Swami described it, when a master incarnates, an area of calm is created in the otherwise tumultuous sea of Maya. And anyone who moves into that area the pull of Maya is less. And Swami wasn't talking just about those who had the physical experience of being with Master, or speaking from my perspective, the physical experience of being with Swamiji, because it's an energy field. And it's an energy field that is based on attunement. And physical proximity gives you the potential for attunement, but physical proximity is not attunement. It's just simply a material experience that can be turned into attunement, but is not necessarily going to be that way. So I've often been aware of the, I guess I would call it the aura of grace that emanates from Master's teaching, from Master, from Swamiji, within Ananda, with any place that Master's vibration is really strongly felt. It's there's just a power in that. And what interests me, and this is what I was going to say, it's like it's the good karma of his incarnation actually changes our reality. I mean, there's many ways that we talk about how the Guru works out karma for us, takes upon himself difficult karma that otherwise we would have to work through in our own physical and mental and emotional selves. But as Swami says, if a strong man is going to hit a weaker man, but if a stronger man takes the blow on his own shoulder, a blow that may severely injure a weak person, the Master won't even feel it. It won't even bruise him. So Master literally comes between us and our karma. Swami talked about it once. He said that he was quoting Master, that Master said that, karma works in a very almost mathematical way. A follows B, B follows C, C follows D. He said, but when you become a devotee, it stops working that way. In other words, that the Guru just plays havoc with it in a positive way. And this is also why serving the Master's work, serving the Master's work, I mean, where will the positive result of the Master's karmic actions go, except to those who are in that same flow of energy? So we scarcely can begin to appreciate what comes to us when we serve a Master's work, and also, interestingly, when you give money to it. There's this letter that we have. As it turns out, Anandi Cornell, who many of you know, her uncle was very involved with Master. She didn't know that. I'm not sure she knew her uncle well. I'm not, actually I'm completely unclear on that. But he was involved with Master in Master's early years and in the city of St. Louis where she grew up, Anandi grew up and her uncle lived. And she found among his things a handwritten letter from Master that that encouraged him to, I think he put it, to stand behind the St. Louis meditation group and asked him to contribute money to support the group and to keep it strong and vital. And he said, and God will bless you very much, including spiritual realization. And Swamiji was fascinated by that when he read it, because he'd never seen anywhere else where Master said, if you give money, Divine Mother will bless you with divine realization, because you wouldn't necessarily think of those things being attached to each other. But when you support a spiritual work, and as Master himself put it, every good, noble, or philanthropic enterprise in the world, sooner or later comes down to a matter of money. And when you give money to a cause that then brings greater enlightenment to other people, you might not be capable of bringing the enlightenment, but if you hadn't given the money, the opportunity for that enlightenment to be delivered either by the Guru himself or by his qualified instruments, that would never have happened if you hadn't given the money. So a person giving money, even to support others to do the spiritual work, that good karma comes back on you. I've never earned any money in my life, but I inherited a little bit. And much of what I inherited, I gave to Swamiji to use for Ananda's work in various ways, or gave it to other aspects of Ananda. And it took me more years than I'm proud to admit when it finally occurred to me, what very good karma my parents got. My father, who earned all that money through his hard work, and my mother, who preserved it with her frugality and her care. But because of them, many people will be introduced to these teachings in various ways. Isn't that interesting? And all of that good karma, because the Master's karma doesn't attach to him, but the good works are there, so the energy flows out. I can't say more deeply than that, but it fascinates me, and I've thought about it a lot. So what also is going on in this particular verse, because it's followed by, as Swami said, the subsequent stanzas in the Gita here all concern themselves with various types of rituals that are performed by different spiritual aspirants for different reasons. So here Krishna is introducing this. So what we're working for first is to become detached from our ego. And now these are like spiritual ideas that I've been hearing, of course, since the first time I ever heard Swami talk, and since I came to Ananda and all of that. Just this whole idea that we are not what we think we are. I've quoted before, but it's a wonderful Michael Singer, who wrote a couple of best-selling books, The Untethered Soul and The Surrender Experiment. They're excellent books. Michael is a disciple of Master, and he's been doing a wonderful ministry for years. And he did some marvelous translating of very deep spiritual ideas into wonderfully accessible. And here's the one that I want to talk about for a moment. He says, there's always somebody talking in our minds, just running a running dialogue, an observation of what's going on. But he points out that there's always also somebody listening. And sometimes the person who is listening has a different opinion than the person who is talking. And he called it like that. When he was trying without talking about God and Guru so much, he was just trying to make it understandable. He said, it's like having a roommate that's always talking to you. And then he points out and he says, do you always believe what your roommate says? And what he was also trying to get across to us is that there seems to be a consciousness that is not the same as the one that we normally think of as ourselves. In other words, that one who's always listening and evaluating and wondering. Sort of, while the roommate, so to speak, the mental roommate, just keeps talking on. So the scriptures all give us this possibility that it's possible to be aware, to be oneself, but to realize that that limited, identified one is not really who I am. Swami used to describe Swami Kriyananda. He described Swami Kriyananda as an event for which he was responsible, and therefore certain actions were required from him. He had to behave in a certain way, he had to be responsible, he had to persevere. I mean, all kinds of things that he had to do, just like if you were putting on a big party. I mean, I've been responsible for putting on quite a number of major events, and I have a very clear understanding of what it is to put on an event and how incredibly engaged you have to be. But no one, unless you're mentally unbalanced, would think that the big event you were putting on was actually you. And when the saints look at us and they see us so deeply identified with all of the things that happen to us, and feeling so strongly that I have to be this certain way because of all these things that happen to me, even gender, race, neglect, support, betrayal, unconditional love, all these things that have happened to us, we add them up and we remember them, and we think that that's who I have to be. But the masters tell us, quite simply, no, you don't. That is an event that you are involved in. There's no question that you are involved in the event. But to make our reality that ego, to think this is who I really am, there's an interesting definition of attachment that Swami presented in his book about money magnetism, which is also another series of discussions I've been doing in the mornings. He says detachment is being so inflexible that you can't easily adapt to change. And I thought that was such an interesting way to put it. I mean, attachment is a very hard sort of thing to understand, but he describes it as being so inflexible. Because people then think that to be non-attached means to be uncommitted. But if you're deeply committed to something, one of the things that commitment it requires is adaptability. Because let's, in human terms, for example, or even you're committed to your children, look how your children change. Look how what they want from you on one day is so different than the other. It's usually around the age of 12. It happens to be usually the classical onset of puberty. But it's also that a child gets a little bit of a vacation from ego identification. And usually about the age of 12, the child really begins to identify with its behavior. Prior to that, children, things will happen, but they won't define themselves by what's happened, which is one of the extremely important rules of parenting, that the child does not define itself by its behavior. So the parent needs to be sure that it has the relationship with the child, and that the child and the parent then talk about the behavior, and not talk to the child as if he is his behavior. That's very confusing to many children for a long time, because things happen, but they don't necessarily define themselves by those things that happen. When I was mentioning the onset of puberty at 12, there was this little boy in our community. He's now a grown man. But when he was little, he was about, I think he must, well, let me think for a minute. Oh, no, I know what it was. Yeah, he was about 10 or something like that. He was very interested in being a grown-up. He was okay as a child, but he was really interested in being a grown-up. And he was outside just playing basketball with one of his friends, and he kept coming into the house. It was the middle of the day, late morning, and he kept coming into the house and looking at the clock, and then he'd go outside again. And finally his mother said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, someone told me that puberty starts at 12. And he thought when noontime came, that would be it. He would start becoming a man. So the child brain sort of doesn't always get every detail. But in any case, when we finished this thought about being 12 years old, one parent put it to me like this. He said, you have this happy relationship with your child, and then your child turns 12, and you say something perfectly innocent, like, "Honey, don't forget to take your textbook when you go to class today." And your child turns on you and says, "You hate me, you've always hated me." And you just think, well, who is this and where did they come from? But when you question their behavior, all of a sudden you're questioning them. Now just think about that. Because all of us, somebody questions our behavior, they question our appearance, they question our decisions, just all kinds of things. And we have this very strong feeling that I myself have been criticized, don't we? And Masters, that's ego attachment. When Swami Kriyananda was faced with some very serious litigation, some legal challenges that had to be answered, and he was the object of the attack. In the American legal system, this is not true in all countries, so let me explain this. In the American legal system, if somebody files a civil suit, a civil litigation against you, and you don't defend yourself, you lose by default. There's no sort of interim stage. You have to go in and defend yourself. There's no point of evaluation, which I've subsequently learned that in some countries there is, where it's determined whether the case has merit or not. So litigation is a weapon that can be used if you have it in for someone, if you can afford to do it. So when Swamiji was faced with litigation, and Ananda as a whole was swept into it, if Swamiji did not stand strongly and defend himself, then all of Ananda would have been pulled down, because we would have lost by default, like that. And Swami, it was a serious moral dilemma for him, because he said it's always been a matter of principle with him that he's here to overcome his ego, not to defend it. And so whatever, if people want to, denigrate or smear or in any way go after him, it was a matter of principle with him not to defend his ego. He ultimately decided that it wasn't his ego. He had to defend himself, but it was really the rest of us he was standing up for, because we had trusted him. And if we didn't defend ourselves, then we would have lost everything, and our lives would also have been impacted. So he had to do it. But it's always been interesting to me, a matter of principle not to defend the ego. In Swami's advice for his book, Sadhu Beware, which is just about a more Dwapara Yuga way of being a renunciate. I mean, one of the pieces of advice Swami gives is, he says, if people misunderstand you, don't rush in to explain yourself. In some cases, of course, it's essential. It's a matter of it's not defensive, it's honest. If chaos is going to ensue because of a misunderstanding, it may be necessary to correct it in the name of truth. But if all we're defending is our own reputation and our desire to look good in front of people, pause for a minute. Is it really necessary that everybody know who I am? It's like, what is important? And this is what we're saying here. When ego attachment ceases, when the ego happens around us, but we're no longer identified with it, all one's actions are offered up to the infinite. And this is what we're all trying to come to, which is that we act in this world, but we're trying to act like the Masters act, which is, I'm here because God sent me here, and I have a certain job to do. but I'm only doing it for the divine. And everything that I'm doing, my success, my failure, my fatigue, my joy, my victory, I hand it all to the divine. None of it is for my own reality. And then he says, both for such a person who is truly ego detached, the act of self-offering and the offering itself are equally aspects of one spirit, which is everything begins to, once we are able to just expand beyond the limitations imposed upon us when we identify with separation. You know, what the problem with the ego is that it separates us. It's like all the egos appear to be separate, whereas the observer, the roommate, the one who's always listening, is actually just watching it like a play. And it never, the true self never comes out from the ocean. It's the ocean wave. The wave is the ego. But the ego is just made up of the same seawater. And when it dissolves, it just goes back. And do we live at the tip of the wave, or do we live in the great ocean below? And you can see the great ocean has to lift the wave up. That's how we can be responsible for the event. But what do I identify with? Do I abandon my sense of greater reality in order to live in this wave? Or do I govern the wave from the perspective of the infinite? A friend of mine wrote me that she has a friend who's in her early 90s, and that friend has suddenly, or very dramatically recently, just lost interest in living. There just isn't. The body is very weak, and there's no appetite, there's no capacity to go out and do things, and it's just a desire just to go to bed and just wait until the body is shed. And you know, there's like this compelling thing that we feel like people have to engage with the world, but there comes a point where the soul really knows, I'm done here. I remember when my mother had already passed, when my father, whose mind was a little scrambled by that point, he was being taken care of, and his caregiver called and said, you know, your father doesn't want to get out of bed, he doesn't want to eat, he doesn't want to drink anything. I said, just let him be. And my sister and brother and I went to be with him. And he was really finished. He just lay down, and in 3 days later, he was gone. Just very quietly and beautifully, actually. But it's like, why would I not just let him go at that point? He'd finished his life. His mind was scrambled. His body wasn't working all that well. Just let it go. You know, it just depends on whether we're attached to that ego limitation that's defined by this body. It all starts by one body. Because once you have one body, you're separate from other people. You only have one culture, you only have one race. You have you have a height, you have a weight, you have a skin color, you have eyes, and just all of this. And once you have this one, you can't have that one. But that's not really who we are. We're all made out of the same spirit, just waves of the ocean who all look unique and different, but are not really so. So he says, the fire of wisdom and the person making the offering are both spirit. In this realization, the yogi goes straight to Brahman. Now, Swami talks about how many religious rituals there are, and how different they appear. But all of them, because this is the next sections of the Gita here, all about different rituals, all of these rituals have really just one objective. It's for us to release our limitation and to realize our divinity. And Swami talks about, he starts with the concept of a simple bow, which, you know, bowing our heads is either a gesture of respect, or in many spiritual traditions, people feel that you have to bow your head to pray. In the yogic tradition, of course, we want to keep our spine straight, but but we have the pranam, which is where you bow your head down in respect, join your palms together, bow your head in respect. And Swami says this is based on a metaphysical truth, which is the ego is centered in the medulla, the medulla right here. This is one of Master's very interesting emphases on the teaching of self-realization as he presents it. The ego is centered in the medulla. He says the sperm and ovum, when they come together and unite, it's right here at the medulla. And they can't, there's no way that even the most advanced surgeons can operate on the medulla. If anything impinges upon the medulla, its life stops at that point, because this is the origin point. And the medulla and the spiritual eye are the opposite poles of the same chakra. They're both the sixth chakra. And the medulla is where the life force enters, and it's where the ego rests. And this is why when people are very proud and egotistical, we talk about them looking down their nose. It really isn't about the nose. It's that if you create a lot of tension in the medulla, it tends to lift your chin up and, pull your head back a little bit. Often when you're watching public figures who are not yogis and have a lot of investment in who they are, like popular singers and so on like that, it's actually quite amazing to watch them, because their heads will move really a lot. And you'll see that the movement is from a little spasm that happens at the medulla. And their heads jerk and they pull back like this, because the ego active principle is so strong in the medulla. Now, because these are the opposite pole, when the life force flows into the medulla, what we really want to do is we want to bring it to a focus at the spiritual eye. And the spiritual eye, of course, is this great energy center, this fiery power of spirit, in which all the chakras, all the yogic practice is to bring all of the chakras up to a focus at the spiritual eye, and to hold the life force at the spiritual eye, so that the power of the divine can dissolve all the karmic vrittis, all the attachments, all the ego identification. And so what we're really doing is we're taking the ego at the medulla and we're offering it into the light of the spiritual eye. It's really, it's a wonderful part of meditating when we meditate with that understanding. When you do Kriya or any kind of meditation that causes you to bring your energy up through the spine, and when Master teaches us to raise energy up through the chakras, it always goes from the throat chakra to the medulla, and then from the medulla to the spiritual eye. And this is the metaphysical explanation of all the rituals that we do in which we offer something into the fire. I was talking, let me finish the thought about the pronoun and the bow, because I lost it for a moment. If you completely relax the medulla and completely let go of any sense of tension about who I am, relax the medulla, the head drops down. And this is why the bow is universally a gesture of respect and humility, because some part of us remembers that tension in the medulla emphasizes that egoic separateness. Relaxation of the medulla, the letting go, as Krishna is encouraging us here, of that ego involvement. Now, but all rituals that we're doing, when we're taking our limited self and we're offering it into the fire or into the light. So many rituals are about fire and light, because it's a tremendously transforming energy. And everything in this world is a symbol of the spiritual world. It's an amazing thing to contemplate, that everything that has meaning to us here is because it symbolizes a greater reality than the reality that we're perceiving with our senses. So in the Festival of Light that we do in Europe and in America every Sunday, there's a point in that ritual when we're holding a candle, And we say, gaze upon this light as a symbol of God's love. And I often do that in the temple that we have here in our Palo Alto community. And that the temple is a very large room. It's a very spacious temple. And when I'm holding that candle, the flame is very small. And before we were sheltered, quarantined as we have been for this last year of 2020, there would be, 150 people or so in that room too. All those people in that room looking at this candle, the candle flame looks really tiny. But I'm aware of the fact that if I took that candle flame and, just touched a few flammable elements in that temple, of which we always have beautiful cloths on the altar, and there's lots of things that would burn. It's a stone building, but there's lots of things in it that would burn. That little flame, which isn't even an inch long, it could take that whole building. It could take the whole building down and just turn it into ash. The entire form of the building could be destroyed. I lived through 1976, which was now a long time ago, June 10th or 11th, I think it was, in 1976, when a great deal of what is the community of Ananda Village, a great deal of it burned, and 21 houses just went to ash. It wasn't like it was a scorched room. It was like nothing. These were, little wooden cabins and small houses that we'd built. They were just intensely flammable, and this extraordinary forest fire came. The forest fire was caused by a faulty spark arrestor on a county vehicle. This became an issue because some of our neighbors filed a lawsuit, and it was proven that that was what it was, and they got a big insurance settlement. We chose not to do that. But a county vehicle had been just going one of the rural roads there, and a spark, and I guess sometimes an engine will throw off a spark. And there's supposed to be a catch device on the truck, but there wasn't. And it had been 7 years of drought. And in California in the summer, people from the East Coast find this odd. In the summer, California goes brown. In the winter, it goes green. Because where I live, at least, it doesn't freeze, so the grass comes up. And in the summer, the grass is bone dry. And after all that drought, so one spark from that truck ignited the grass. And the grass was downhill from where we are, and this huge, huge hillside of grass started burning habitually. Almost every afternoon, the wind came from a certain direction, which would be behind the fire, pushing the fire uphill in all this dry grass. And it was extraordinary. And I was standing up there, with Jyotish as it happened, and I'm just looking at this. It was still far enough away, but it was just a wall of fire, and it was just coming right at us, and there was nothing but dry grass between our community and that fire. Jyotish, I said, it looks like Ananda's going to burn. He says, yeah, it certainly looks like it's going to burn. And it did. That section of Ananda, 450 acres of it. But the power of fire thrills us in a certain way. And we were fascinated by it. Because what we're really looking at is we're looking at the power of the divine fire within. Now, we tend to see fire, especially in the way I'm describing it, as destructive. And it is destructive if you have spent time and money, and we'd certainly spent a great deal of time and money to build something, and then the fire just takes it down. But the other side of fire is that it just transforms everything. It breaks all forms, and it liberates. It liberates form. So when we have to think of it symbolically within ourselves, we have to realize that what physical fire can do is impressive. There's no question about it being impressive. But it's nothing compared to what the divine fire can do. Because the the form of the ego is infinitely stronger than the form of any material substance. That's why we can shed our bodies over and over again in countless incarnations. And the ego still perseveres. This has always been sort of on the edge of madness with me, so I don't like to go there too far, but it just, I can't think about it too much, because it does kind of tip me into an altered state that's not an elevated one, which is the fact that the individuality is always there, that I will always exist. And when I used to meditate every morning, which I did for years with the same group of women, about 7, 10, 15 of us at a time, we would have these wonderful, deep meditations. And I would joke, because we would always go home as the same person we came in with. And I had this feeling that all of our ego identifications were just sort of launched up into the roof of, as it happened, it was a teepee, but up into the upper part of the teepee where we were meditating. And I was always surprised that we always knew which one to take home. I think ego disidentification was not that simple. But we would become so unified, and then we would still, each of us, go home exactly with the same ego that we'd come in with. Transformed a little, I will admit. But the light of the divine has the capacity to break all limitation. And that's the power that we have at the spiritual eye. And that's why so many rituals. We do arati, we hold lights, we have these lights, we're always offering. We're offering. In puja, you have all these, puja, which is a ritualized worship, you have all these symbols that represent all the different senses. You have incense, you have the sound of a bell, you even have a horse's tail or a feather, something that symbolizes touch. You have light. Just all of our senses are carried out. And then we offer them. We put them on the altar. We do some kind of a ritual, some way or another. Even the Christian communion, we're taking in the body and the blood of Christ, which actually means the consciousness, the Christ consciousness, and the power of the Om is what they really symbolize. In some way or another, to cause us to let go of this thing that we're holding on to. So, a very serious and a very good practice for all of us is whenever we're quick to defend ourselves, quick to defend our tastes, quick to defend our preferences, just stop for a minute and ask why. Why am I so, how did I even decide that this was the way to be? It's just so interesting to sort of get to know other people and see how just very, very differently people move through the world. And we begin to see how perfectly arbitrary our preferences are. I was so amused by this humorous statement that someone gave me. It was from George Bush, the second George Bush, who was president of the United States. It was a father and a son, and there's a middle initial, but I never know which one was which. But it was the younger, it was the son. And it was a quote from him, and he said, "I have never liked broccoli, but when I was living in my parents' house, my mother always made me eat broccoli." He said, "Now I am president of the United States, and I am never going to eat broccoli again." Something about that. I mean, he was saying it just as a joke too. But I thought, well, I suppose when you are the leader of such a powerful country, I suppose you can determine whether you'll eat broccoli or not. But what amused me about it is, my, these things just follow us, don't they? We just have all these ideas about who we are and what we want. Swamiji himself, he said it himself, the words he used were, he says, "I'm a very picky eater. There's only a few things that I like." And those of us who cooked for him learned what his preferences were, and we followed his preferences. He wasn't unpleasant. He was very charming, but if you were going to cook for him, you might as well cook for him in a good way. I like beets. Swami didn't like beets. I had developed a particular dish, which is in the Simply Vegetarian book. It was one of my contributions to Ananda's cookbook. And I thought it was a very good, I thought it made the beets quite delicious. And I kept telling Swami I could make them in a way that he would like. He kept insisting no, but then he finally said to me, he said, why should I be limited by something as trivial as my dislike of beets, he said. So he invited me to make the dish for him. So I did. And afterwards, in his wonderful way, Swami said, if I were ever going to eat beets again, he said, that is certainly the way I would eat them, but I choose not to eat them again, just like that. But what he was also demonstrating was, let's stop and think about it. Let's really stop and think about it. And when we enter into these rituals, which are often very simple, but we enter into these rituals, whether or not they have power, Swami explains it. And again, because the Gita is going to be dealing with this for a while. A ritual, it's not magic. It's nobody can do it for you. You can't just sit there and have the priest or the pujari make you free. You have to not only participate in the outer form of the ritual, but you have to really understand what this is symbolizing, and then give your energy to what is really happening there. And then, really, as we all know, as we may know, really very powerful things can happen. But it's not just from the words that are being spoken. And sometimes people get superstitious. Superstition and spirituality are not the same thing. Sentiment and spirituality are not the same thing. It has to be deeply and profoundly transforming. But rituals are very, very helpful because it brings our attention to something. We did a ritual here. We've been sorting out some issues in relationship to our community, and it started a few years ago. And we reached a certain impasse where it just could not think about how to move the situation forward. And it came to me, when Swamiji dedicated this community, he dedicated it to Babaji, who is the founding guru of our line of gurus. And I thought, let's just rededicate the community to Babaji. And we have this, in September, we have had an outdoor event, which is always, it's a community building event, community in the sense of people, the unity, the friendship building energy. It's not building physical things. And so we put a bonfire. We put a big bonfire. We have an open courtyard, a green area. And we brought this huge steel bowl that we have. It's a fire pit, freestanding fire pit. And we put a great many logs into that. And we built a really, really extraordinarily beautiful big fire. Then we did mantras over that fire, and we offered all the fruit of our labors and the fate of Master's work. We just offered it into that fire. And I've been part of a lot of ceremonies in the course of my life, but that one really stands out. Just sometimes when you really give, and I've had lots of bonfires and I've done those mantras a lot of times, but sometimes you really give yourself to it. And that's what God is asking. It's all about self-offering. Everything is about self-offering. He calls it ego detachment. It's a funny thing. Detaching from your ego. Let me just try to think how to say this. It's like we think that when we hold on, we don't realize when we're holding on to our ego that we're holding ourselves small. I had a fever. I don't get fevers very often. I can almost remember the number of times I've had fever. I have friends who kind of get fevers regularly. It's just the way their bodies work. But it doesn't happen to me, and so it's not the way my body works. So I had this fever. I was living at Ananda Village. I had gone to visit my parents. They lived in Southern California. I went to stay with them just for a couple of days, but I got very sick. I had been working on some huge project. I don't remember what it was, but it was kind of the finishing of that karma. I got very sick, and I got a very high fever. When I actually finally took my temperature, when I thought I was getting well, I think it was like 103. So I don't know what I was before that, but I'd had like an overnight of a very high fever in which I became quite delirious. Not quite delirious, but somewhat delirious. Because there I was in the bed, and I was curled up on my side in the fetal position, with my knees pulled in and my arms pulled in. And I was there for quite some period of time, and I was quite certain that if I relaxed at all, and certainly if I stretched out, that my four limbs, my two legs and my two arms, would break away from my trunk and then just go running off. And so it was very important that I remained there just, clutching onto my limbs. Otherwise, I wouldn't have them anymore. And after God knows how long it was, and I think the fever began to go down, I began to reason it out. And it occurred to me, I could remember that I had not spent the entirety of my life curled up tightly in the fetal position, and that I still seemed to have both my arms and both my legs. So some doubt began to enter my mind about this system that I was operating on. And I remember very, very cautiously beginning to uncurl myself and just be so relieved to discover I could just lie on my back again. Now, that's how we feel about our ego. We have this idea that if we don't hold on super tight to who I am, if I don't defend my point of view, if I don't stand up for myself, if I don't take care of my needs, if I don't, all these things, if I don't, me, just be myself, but we're not being myself at all. We're just being this little tiny, limited carbon copy of our true self. But we hold it that tightly. That's why in a lot of yogic teaching and the art of meditation, it's a tremendous amount about relaxation. And it's a little confusing. It's more than a little confusing, because we think we have to strive for excellence. We have to do all these things, and we do. But what we have to do primarily is realize that, let me think, nothing is threatening us. The only thing that's threatening us is us. And the ego itself is, it's seriously threatened. We went through a period of time at Ananda Village. It's just one of the growing pains that communities go through. And people were picking up a lot of jargon from, I was going to say, from the outside world. And I have to say that is how I feel a lot of time, from modern society. It's not that everything about modern society is bad, but some things are misguided. And people started talking about Ananda, the village, the communities, that it should be a safe place. Community should be a safe place. It's a place where I should feel safe, they would say. I said, actually, no. You ought to feel threatened all the time when you're in the community. And I don't mean by that, by any means, that, it should be a negative place. That's not at all what I'm talking about. I was being a little bit humorous about it. But we should feel like our limited self is always being scraped away. And that, but way we have to think about it is that our spirit is being liberated because it's being held prisoner by this very limited idea of who we are. And it's just as the grip of that self-preoccupation begins to wane, there's just such a marvelous sense of freedom, such a marvelous sense of who really cares. I love being older for that reason. It's just like one realizes that just so many of the things that I was fighting for, I didn't have to fight for them. I could just either have let them go or just waited to see whether they came or not. But I was too earnest, much too earnest, it's so weird. We're so weirdly insecure that we fight all the time for the thing that makes us so insecure. What makes us insecure is because we're so limited. I actually, when I look back on my my life before Ananda, which was 24 years, less than that, 22, and I look for the unifying thread of my search for meaning before I had the vocabulary for it. Really, I got the vocabulary when I was 18. But there was a unified consciousness from my earliest memories, and the word was limitation. I didn't have that word then. I didn't get that word till much later. But I could never figure out why everything that the world was offering me and that so many people seemed to want, it just seemed almost the opposite to me. And it's because it was so limited. There was just some intuitive yogic memory that there was this unlimited potential. And no matter how much of this world's stuff I was able to collect, I was less interested in material things and more interested in, actually, I don't know, but more inner realities, self-expression, a fulfillment of destiny, that sort of thing. I never lived long enough before I came on the spiritual path to have to transfer it beyond childhood ideas, fortunately. But there was this feeling of potential. It was always there, and other people did not seem to even know about it, what to speak of ever being able to tell me how to get there. And so they just kept offering me these toys, is how it looked to me. It's just like, why would a serious person really want to devote their life to that? And of course, I had a strong karma. So I now understand I was intolerant and rude, which wasn't really such a good idea. And now I have much more compassion and understanding and sympathy and respect and appreciation for how many different paths there are. Because, of course, once I found mine, I didn't have to be so avid about rejecting everything else. Once you come to peace inside yourself, you can be quite peaceful about everything around you. But when my own destiny felt threatened all the time, you have to fight a lot harder. But you see, all of that, why? Once we retreat a little bit from the wave and expand out into the ocean, then the waves still happen, and it still takes a lot of our time and energy to deal with it. The event for which we are responsible is a full-time job. But when we live in the wave, we're so vulnerable. But when we can expand into the ocean, then we have the power of the infinite behind us. I'm not speaking to you from realization. I'm speaking to you from someone who's walking this path with you and saying, that's where we're trying to go. And let us go there together. God bless you, my friend.